My name is Caroline Mercer, I'm 42 years old, and I work as a structural engineer. The morning my mother laughed over blueberry pancakes and called my ex-fiancé, still like a son. Everything I thought I knew about my family collapsed so hard inside me, it felt like a bridge giving out under its own weight. By noon that same day, I had lost my appetite, my trust in my mother, and eventually the last clean memory I had of the man I thought I was going to marry. You spend enough years designing buildings, you learn something ugly about failure. Most collapses don't happen all at once. Steel bends long before concrete cracks. Tiny fractures hide inside support columns for years before anyone hears the sound. That breakfast was just the moment I finally heard it. It was Sunday, October 8, 2023. My mother still hosted these giant family breakfasts twice a month at her house in Stamford, Connecticut. The same polished oak table, the same fake autumn wreath hanging over the stove no matter the season, the same suffocating performance of family closeness. I almost didn't go. I'd worked 73 hours that week reviewing damage assessments for a commercial parking structure in White Plains. A support beam had been improperly welded 6 years earlier, and the floor had spread silently until one entire corner of the garage started sinking 3 inches. That kind of thing haunted me, because people trust what holds them up. At least they're supposed to. I arrived around 9:10 a.m. carrying bakery muffins nobody touched. My younger brother Adam was already there with his wife Nicole and their twin boys screaming over orange juice. My mother, Diane, floated around the kitchen in one of her cream-colored cashmere sweaters, acting 20 years younger than she was. My father died in 2018 from pancreatic cancer, and ever since then she had developed this exhausting need to remain desirable, relevant, adored. Every room became a stage. "Caroline," she said when I walked in, "you look tired." Not hello. Not good morning. Just tired. I kissed her cheek anyway. "You look expensive," I replied. Adam laughed into his coffee. Mom smiled tightly because she knew exactly what I meant. Then she said the sentence that cracked my life open. "You know who I ran into Thursday? Daniel. He still asks about you. Honestly, he's still like a son to me." The room tilted. Not visibly, nobody else noticed. But inside me something shifted off-center. Daniel. 3 years since he left me. 3 years since he stood in our apartment kitchen with tears in his eyes claiming he wasn't ready for marriage. 3 years since he cancelled our wedding 6 weeks before invitations went out. I remember exactly what I was holding when he ended it. A ceramic mug with a chipped handle. I remember because I stared at the crack in the glaze while he talked, trying to understand how something breaks before you notice the damage. Structural engineers think like that. We're always looking for stress fractures. "You talked to Daniel?" I asked carefully. Mom poured syrup onto pancakes, briefly at Whole Foods. Nicole suddenly got very interested in cutting strawberries. Adam stared into his mug. That was the first moment my stomach tightened. Families have silences, every family does, but there are different kinds. Comfortable silence, grieving silence, and guilty silence. This was guilty silence. Mom kept talking. "He's doing consulting now apparently, very successful. Such a shame things turned out the way they did between you two." I heard my own fork scrape the plate. Then she smiled. "But honestly, sweetheart, he just wasn't right for you long term." The way she said it. Confident. Certain. Like she had approved the outcome. And suddenly, a memory surfaced so sharply it made my skin prickle. February 2020. 3 months before Daniel left me. I had walked into our apartment unexpectedly early because a site inspection got cancelled during heavy rain. Daniel had been standing in the kitchen speaking quietly on the phone. The second he saw me, he hung up. I'd laughed and asked, "Secret girlfriend?" He looked nervous. "No, your mom's." At the time, I thought nothing of it. My mother adored Daniel, more than she ever adored me, honestly. But now, sitting at that breakfast table with maple syrup thick in the air and my nephews arguing beside me, Something ugly began arranging itself into place inside my head. Like load calculations finally balancing. "Mom," I said slowly, "why were you talking to Daniel so much before we broke up?" Her eyes flicked up too fast. "Excuse me. You called him constantly." "Oh please, Caroline, we were close." Adam shifted in his seat. Nicole looked horrified now. And that's when I knew. Families are systems, like buildings, pressure transfers. Weight moves through every connection point. One weak joint affects everything around it. I looked directly at my brother. "What do you know?" "Caroline, what do you know?" Mom set down her fork hard enough to clink. "This is ridiculous." But Adam wouldn't meet my eyes. My chest went cold. "Adam," he rubbed his forehead. "I thought you knew." That sentence, God, you ever have a moment where your body understands pain before your brain catches up? My fingertips went numb. "Knew what?" Mom snapped Adam enough. But he looked sick now. I overheard Mom talking to Daniel before the wedding. The kitchen became completely silent, except for one of the twins humming to himself. "What conversation?" I asked. Adam swallowed. "She offered him money." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the alternative was vomiting. "What?" Mom stood immediately. "This is absurd." "How much?" I whispered. Adam stared at the table. 30,000. I looked at my mother. She crossed her arms defensively, and in that instant I realized the truth before she even admitted it. Not shame. Not regret. Just irritation at being exposed. "You paid him to leave me." Her face hardened. "I helped him make the right decision." I think part of me died right there at that breakfast table. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a support cable snapping underwater. Nicole grabbed the boys and took them outside without a word. Adam looked devastated. And my mother, my own mother, sighed like I was inconveniencing her. "You were never going to work," she said. "You exhausted him." I could barely hear. "What?" "You're intense, Caroline, you always have been. Work first, control first, schedules, plans, spreadsheets. You treated that relationship like a construction project." I stared at her. "I loved him." "I know you did." "Then why?" And finally, the truth surfaced. Because people eventually tell you who they are once they stop needing your approval. Mom looked directly at me and said, "Because he wanted children and warmth and ease, you were turning into your father." There it was. The oldest wound in my life. My father and I were alike, quiet, analytical, careful with words. We both loved systems more than parties, numbers more than appearances. My mother hated that about him by the end. And apparently she hated it in me too. I pushed my chair back slowly. "You paid my fiancé to leave me." "I gave him an opportunity," she snapped. "And frankly, if $30,000 could end your engagement, then it wasn't real love anyway." I remember the smell of burnt bacon. The ticking clock above the microwave. Adam saying, "Mom, stop." But she kept going. "You always make yourself the victim. Do you know how hard you are to love sometimes?" That sentence hit harder than the rest. Because it wasn't new. It was just finally undeniable. Growing up, I was never the easy daughter. Adam played soccer and smiled in school pictures. Adam got average grades and hugs. I built model bridges out of popsicle sticks at age 10 and corrected teachers when textbooks had math errors. My mother once introduced 12-year-old me to a neighbor by saying, "Caroline's brilliant, but she's not exactly personable." I heard it. She knew I heard it. At 14, I won a statewide engineering scholarship competition. Dad took me out for ice cream afterward. Mom complained during dinner that I sounded arrogant talking about it. At 17, when Adam forgot Mom's birthday, she laughed it off. When I forgot because I was at a robotics competition in Boston, she cried for 2 days and told relatives I didn't care about family. Everything with her was emotional architecture. Adam was allowed to exist naturally. I was constantly being remodeled. And Daniel. God, Daniel. For years I thought he was the first person who chose me exactly as I was. We met in July 2016 at a city permit hearing in Manhattan. I was presenting revisions for a mixed-use development project. He was representing a consulting firm handling environmental compliance. Afterward, he told me I argued like someone defending a kingdom. I laughed so hard I snorted coffee through my nose. He kissed me 3 weeks later outside a diner in Queens at 1:14 a.m. after we'd spent 4 straight hours debating whether people were fundamentally selfish. You think too much, he told me that night. But he said it affectionately then, like it was something lovable. For years he made me feel safe. He'd touch the back of my neck when I worked too late. He'd bring me Thai food during deadline weeks. One February night in 2019, I fell asleep on the couch reviewing seismic load calculations and woke up covered with a blanket while he quietly washed dishes in the kitchen. I remember thinking, this is what peace feels like. So after he left, I blamed myself completely. I replayed every argument, every late work night, every exhausted cancellation. I spent nearly 18 months believing I had engineered my own heartbreak. And all along my mother had bribed him to walk away. I left breakfast without another word. Mom called after me once. Caroline, don't be dramatic. Dramatic. I drove 30 miles home barely remembering the road. When I got inside my condo, I sat on the kitchen floor for almost 2 hours staring at cabinet handles. People think betrayal feels explosive. Sometimes it feels mechanical, like bolts loosening one turn at a time. Around 2:40 p.m., I called Daniel for the first time in nearly 2 years. He answered on the 4th ring. Caroline's. His voice still hurt. I know. Silence. Then a long exhale. Oh God. You took the money. Another silence. Yes. I closed my eyes. How long were you going to let me think it was my fault? I never wanted you to think that. But you did. His breathing sounded uneven now. It wasn't that simple. Then explain it to me simply. And he tried. Apparently my mother contacted him privately in January 2020. She invited him to lunch under the excuse of discussing wedding plans. Instead, she told him marrying me would trap him in a cold life. She said I would always choose work over family. She said I didn't know how to love properly. And then she offered him money to leave before the wedding. $30,000. I asked the question I already dreaded. Why did you take it? His answer shattered me worse than the money. Because part of me believed her. I couldn't breathe for a second. She knew exactly where to press, he whispered. Every insecurity I had about us she already understood. That was the thing about my mother. She studied people like weaknesses in a structure. Hairline fractures, pressure points, places to insert force. She told me you'd eventually resent me for wanting children, he said quietly, and honestly, we had fought about it. We had. I wanted kids someday, but not immediately. I was leading a major transportation infrastructure project then and working insane hours. Daniel wanted certainty. Mom weaponized that uncertainty. She said if I really loved you, I'd let you become who you were meant to become. I laughed bitterly. That sounds exactly like her. I'm sorry. Sorry. Such a tiny word for something that large. I finally asked the question sitting like broken glass in my throat. Did you ever love me? He answered immediately. Yes. And somehow that made it worse. Because real love had existed here once. Corrupted by someone who was supposed to protect me. We talked for almost an hour. By the end, I felt strangely calm. Not healed, just structurally clear. Like finally locating the source of a crack after years of guessing. That night, I pulled out an old storage box from my hall closet, containing wedding plans I never managed to throw away. Fabric samples, venue contracts, guest lists, and at the very bottom, a folded handwritten note from my father dated August 17th, 2019. I had forgotten about it entirely. Dad's handwriting slanted sharply to the right. Caroline, it began, if there's one thing engineering taught me, it's that strong foundations matter more than beautiful surfaces. My father had been a mechanical engineer before cancer took him. I sat there crying before I even finished reading. He wrote about Daniel kindly, said he seemed steady, said he hoped I trusted my own judgment more than anyone else's, including family. Then one sentence stopped me cold. Your mother loves fiercely but sometimes selfishly. Don't let her decide your worth. I read that line 7 times. Because suddenly I realized Dad knew. Maybe not the future specifically. But he understood her. Understood me. And understood the damage she could do if I kept chasing her approval. 3 days later, Adam came to my condo carrying takeout and guilt all over his face. I should have told you earlier. Yes, I said. He nodded painfully. I thought she'd eventually admit it. I almost laughed. You do know Mom very well then. He sat across from me quietly. She always treated you differently. There it was again. Validation arriving years too late. Why didn't anyone say anything? Dad tried. That caught my attention. What? Adam rubbed his jaw. The summer before he died, they fought constantly about you. I stared at him. He told her she was too hard on you, said she turned every accomplishment into criticism. My throat tightened. Adam continued softly. He said you spent your whole life trying to earn love that should have been free. I broke then. Completely. Not loud. Not cinematic. Just tears sliding down my face while cold lo mein sat untouched between us. Because all my life I thought maybe if I achieved enough, built enough, succeeded enough, my mother would finally look at me the way she looked at everyone else. But some people need you unfinished so they can feel powerful shaping you. And the moment you stop bending, they punish you for becoming solid. Over the next few weeks, more truths surfaced. Nicole admitted Mom used to call me emotionally defective behind my back. An aunt confessed Mom often compared my appearance unfavorably to other women. Even Daniel eventually sent me screenshots of old messages from Mom warning him I would become impossible after marriage. Each revelation hurt less individually than collectively. Like discovering an entire building was constructed with counterfeit steel. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing how many people quietly watched it happen. Around Thanksgiving, Mom finally came to my condo unannounced. I almost didn't open the door. She stood there in a camel-colored coat, holding pumpkin bread like we were normal people. You've made your point, she said immediately. I actually smiled at that. My point. You've punished me enough. Punished her. Amazing. You paid my fiancé to abandon me. He chose to leave. You manipulated him. I protected him. I stared at her. And suddenly I saw it clearly. My mother genuinely believed love meant control. Not support. Not trust. Control. If she could shape outcomes, she felt safe. And anyone resisting that control became the enemy. You know what the saddest part is, I said quietly. What? I spent 39 years believing there was something fundamentally wrong with me because you treated me like a problem to solve. She rolled her eyes slightly. There you go again, making everything dramatic. That word again. Dramatic. As if pain only counted when she approved its dimensions. Then she said the sentence that ended our relationship. "You were never easy to love, Caroline." I felt something inside me settle permanently, like concrete curing. No anger, no screaming, just certainty. "Maybe," I said calmly, "but I deserve to be loved correctly anyway." She looked stunned, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't asking for understanding. I was stating truth. I handed the pumpkin bread back to her. "You should go." She left furious. I closed the door gently. And that was it. No dramatic cut-off announcement. No social media post. Just silence. The kind that comes after a structure finally stops groaning under impossible weight. The next year changed my life in ways revenge never could have. That's the strange thing nobody tells you. Exposure feels satisfying for about 5 minutes, then you're left standing in the wreckage asking what now. I started therapy in January 2024, every Thursday at 6:00 p.m. The first month, I mostly talked about work because it felt safer. Stress calculations, bridge rehabilitation projects, material fatigue. Eventually, my therapist smiled gently and said, "You describe people like infrastructure." She wasn't wrong, because that's how I survived emotionally. If I could analyze pain, maybe I could contain it. But grief doesn't work like engineering. You can't spreadsheet loneliness. You can't reinforce betrayal with steel beams. You just feel it, over and over, until eventually it stops owning every room in your life. Around March, Daniel emailed asking if we could meet in person. I ignored it for 2 weeks, then finally agreed. We met at a small Italian restaurant in Norwalk on March 18, 2024. He looked older. Not physically exactly. Just heavier somehow. Regret ages people. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said immediately. "Good." He nodded. I deserve that. And honestly, sitting across from him, I realized something surprising. I wasn't in love with him anymore. The grief remained, the betrayal remained. But the wanting had died. Because even if my mother manipulated him, he still handed her the tools. He still chose money over honesty. He still watched me blame myself for years. "I did love you," he said quietly before we left. "I know. You were the best thing that ever happened to me." I looked at him for a long second. Then I said something I genuinely mean even now. "You should have protected that better." And I walked away. Not triumphant. Just done. By summer, Mom had alienated almost everyone. Adam barely spoke to her anymore after learning she'd lied repeatedly about the situation to relatives. Apparently, she told multiple family members I was mentally unstable. Classic Diane. Destroy credibility first. My Aunt Linda finally confronted her publicly during 4th of July dinner. She sabotaged her own daughter's life, Linda snapped. Mom cried naturally. That was always her final defense mechanism. Tears as architecture. Flood the room emotionally until accountability drowns. But people saw through it now. That's another strange thing about truth. Once exposed, old manipulations suddenly look obvious. In September 2024, nearly a year after the breakfast, I received a certified envelope from a law office in Hartford. Inside was documentation from my father's estate attorney. Apparently, Dad had left a private letter and supplemental trust amendment to be delivered if significant familial conflict arose between Mom and me. Reading it felt like hearing his voice again. He wrote about watching me spend my entire life chasing emotional approval from someone incapable of giving it freely. He apologized for not protecting me better while he was alive. That line destroyed me. Then came the part that changed everything materially. Dad had quietly established a separate investment account for me, before his death worth approximately $740,000 by 2024. Mom never mentioned it. Legally, she couldn't touch it, but she delayed disclosure because distribution conditions hadn't yet activated. The activation clause: evidence of intentional emotional or financial harm against me by immediate family. My father knew. Maybe not specifics, but enough to build protection into the foundation before he died. The accompanying letter included one final paragraph I still keep beside my bed. Caroline, strong structures are not built by avoiding pressure. They survive because pressure reveals what was reinforced properly from the start. You were never difficult to love. You were simply surrounded by people who confused obedience with affection. I cried so hard reading that I nearly became sick. Not because of the money. Though God, the security mattered. After years of feeling emotionally disposable, someone had quietly prepared proof that my existence mattered. That I mattered. Mom called screaming after she learned about the trust. You manipulated your dying father against me. I hung up without responding. That was the moment I finally understood boundaries. Not as punishment, as preservation. Today, almost 2.5 years after that breakfast, my life is quieter. Smaller in some ways. Healthier in most. I transferred to a transportation resilience project in Boston and now oversee bridge, retrofitting across several coastal regions. Most days involve inspections, stress analysis, and long meetings about corrosion resistance. I love it. There's honesty in engineering. A structure either holds weight or it doesn't. No manipulation changes the math. I bought a small townhouse near Cambridge in February 2025. Nothing extravagant, red brick, tiny backyard, heated kitchen floors I absolutely didn't need but wanted anyway. Sometimes I sit there drinking coffee before sunrise and think about how strange healing is. It doesn't arrive dramatically. No movie soundtrack. No perfect revenge. Just tiny moments where pain stops being the loudest thing in the room. Adam visits often now, so do the twins. Mom and I speak maybe twice a year. Birthdays mostly. Brief, polite, hollow. People ask if I'll ever fully forgive her. I don't know. Maybe forgiveness isn't always reunion. Maybe sometimes forgiveness is simply refusing to carry hatred heavy enough to collapse your own life. But trust, that never returned. And honestly, that's okay. Because one of the biggest lies family teaches us is that love must include unlimited access. It doesn't. Some people can be your blood and still not be safe for your spirit. Last October, exactly 2 years after the breakfast, I found myself making pancakes alone on a rainy Sunday morning. For a second, the memory hit me hard enough to sting. The syrup. The silence. Adam's guilty face. My mother saying I was hard to love. And then another memory surfaced immediately after. Dad teaching me at 13 how to identify stress fractures in concrete during a site visit. Damage hides where pressure concentrates, he told me. That's why inspections matter. I finally understand what he meant now. Not just in engineering. In people. The cracks were always there. I just spent too many years calling them normal because they were built into my foundation early. If you're reading this because your family made you feel impossible to love, listen carefully. Love that requires you to shrink isn't love. Love that depends on obedience isn't love. And people who sabotage your happiness while calling it protection are not protecting you, they're protecting their control. The hardest thing I ever learned was this. Some structures cannot be repaired from inside, while they're still actively collapsing around you. You have to leave first. Last week, one of my junior engineers accidentally made a calculation error during a stress load review. He looked terrified when he realized it. I'm sorry, he kept saying, I really screwed this up. And without thinking, I told him something I wish someone had told me decades earlier. Mistakes are fixable, hidden damage is what destroys things. He nodded like I'd said something profound. Maybe I had. Or maybe I'm still learning how to rebuild a life using different materials than the ones I grew up with. Either way, for the first time in years, the structure feels stable. Not perfect, not untouched, but mine. About 4 months after I cut contact with my mother, I made the mistake of thinking the worst part was over. That's the thing about emotional collapse. You think the destruction ends when the building stops falling. Nobody warns you about the dust afterward, the way it settles into everything, your clothes, your sleep, your memories. By February 2024, I had become functional again on paper. I showed up to work. I answered emails. I attended meetings about load redistribution and structural fatigue, while pretending my own nervous system wasn't running on emergency power. But internally, I was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. There's a specific loneliness that comes from realizing your childhood wasn't what you thought it was. Every old memory becomes unstable. You revisit conversations from 15 years ago and suddenly hear different meanings inside them. I started doing that constantly. I'd be driving home from work and remember Mom telling 16-year-old me, "No man wants to compete with a woman all the time." At the time, I thought she meant arguments. Now I understood she meant ambition. Another memory surfaced one night while I was brushing my teeth. I was 26 and had just gotten promoted to senior project coordinator. Dad took me out for dinner to celebrate. Mom spent the entire meal talking about Adam's new girlfriend because, according to her, that relationship actually has a future. I remember laughing awkwardly back then. Now I realized she never believed my future mattered in the same way. It's strange how betrayal rewrites your personal history. Around mid-February, my therapist, Dr. Levin, asked me a question that irritated me immediately. When was the first time you remember feeling emotionally unsafe with your mother? I crossed my arms. I wasn't unsafe. She waited. I hated when she did that calm silence thing. Finally, I sighed. When I was 9, I got pneumonia. The memory came back vividly. January 1991. I had a fever over 103 and spent almost a week in bed. Dad stayed home from work 3 days straight. He brought me ginger ale and read me books about bridges because I was obsessed with them already. Mom mostly complained about how disruptive the illness was. At one point, I overheard her on the phone with a friend saying, "Caroline's always been high maintenance." I remember lying there sweating through sheets thinking, I'll try to need less. That realization hit me so hard in Dr. Levin's office, I stopped talking entirely. Children adapt to survive emotionally. Mine was simple. Become low maintenance. Need less. Take up less space. Excel quietly. Maybe then love would feel safer. Except success became another threat eventually. Because the older I got, the less controllable I became. You know what emotionally neglected children often become? Dr. Levin asked gently. I shrugged. Highly competent adults. That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Because competence became my survival strategy. At work, competence was rewarded. In my family, it was resented. Especially by my mother. By March, I had fully stopped answering Mom's calls. She compensated by leaving increasingly dramatic voicemails. Families don't abandon each other. You're humiliating me. You've always exaggerated everything. That last one almost made me laugh. As if secretly paying off your daughter's fiancé was some tiny misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Adam visited one Friday evening carrying Chinese food and bad news. Mom was telling relatives I'd become unstable after the breakup with Daniel. According to her, I was isolating myself and struggling emotionally. Which technically wasn't false. Manipulators survive by mixing truth with distortion. She's trying to control the narrative, Adam said carefully. I know. She told Aunt Rebecca you imagined the whole payment thing. I blinked slowly. What? She said Daniel borrowed money from her and you twisted it into something else. I actually laughed then. A hard, disbelieving sound. She thinks people are stupid. Adam looked uncomfortable. The problem is some people believe her. Of course they did. My mother was charming in public, warm, generous, stylish, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and mailed sympathy cards and hosted beautiful Christmas dinners. People like that rarely get labelled abusive, especially by their own daughters. That's another ugly truth nobody likes discussing. Emotional abuse often looks polished from the outside. No bruises. No screaming. Just years of subtle erosion. The steady message that your feelings are excessive and your needs inconvenient. I asked Adam quietly, did you believe her growing up? He looked confused. About what? That I was difficult. He went silent, which answered the question. I was a kid, he said finally. I know. You were intimidating sometimes. There it was again. Not emotional. Not cold. Intimidating. A word powerful women hear constantly when people actually mean inconvenient. I leaned back against my kitchen counter. Do you know how many times Mom told me I'd end up alone? Adam looked genuinely startled. She said that. All the time. The first time I remember hearing it, I was 19. I had skipped a cousin's baby shower because of finals week during sophomore year at Cornell. Mom stood in the kitchen afterward washing dishes aggressively and said, You know, Caroline, men want warmth, not competition. I remember feeling ashamed without understanding why. Because that's how she worked. Nothing direct enough to quote later. Just tiny emotional cuts disguised as advice. Adam rubbed his forehead. I'm sorry. I know. And honestly, I believed him. My brother wasn't cruel, just conditioned differently. He grew up inside the same house, but under entirely different weather. Mom loved him openly, easily. She criticized him too sometimes, sure, but never fundamentally. Never like me. I think some mothers look at daughters and see reflections instead of children. And if they hate something unresolved in themselves, the daughter pays for it. A week later, something happened that pushed everything into a different level entirely. I received a message on LinkedIn from a woman named Elise Warren. At first I assumed it was work-related. Her profile said she worked in non-profit development in New Jersey. But the message read, Hi Caroline, this is awkward but I think we should talk. It's about your mother and Daniel. My stomach dropped immediately. We scheduled a phone call for that evening. I sat at my dining table gripping tea gone cold while waiting for her to speak. I dated Daniel briefly after you two broke up, she said nervously. Every muscle in my body tightened. Okays. I didn't know who you were at first, then your mother came up. My pulse started pounding. Elise, just tell me. She inhaled shakily. Your mom contacted me directly while Daniel and I were together. I went completely still. What? She found me on Facebook somehow. She invited me to lunch. I felt sick already because I knew where this was going. And she warned me Daniel was emotionally fragile after his relationship with you. Elise hesitated. Then she spent almost an hour talking about how cold and career-obsessed you were. I stared at my dark apartment window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. She said you emasculated him, Elise continued quietly. She told me you made him feel small. That word, small, the irony almost choked me. My entire childhood was spent trying to make myself smaller for my mother. She also said, Elise paused again. What? She said you weren't naturally maternal and probably never would be. Something inside me snapped then. Not loudly, but cleanly. Like a cable cut under tension. I suddenly understood this wasn't just about sabotaging my engagement. My mother had been constructing a narrative about me for years. Cold, difficult, unlovable, too ambitious, too masculine somehow, not nurturing enough. And she'd been feeding it to other people behind my back long before Daniel left. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Because after Daniel and I broke up, I started realizing how manipulative the whole thing felt. Elise sounded embarrassed. "Honestly, I think your mother enjoyed controlling his relationships." I closed my eyes. There it was. Control again. The hidden framework underneath everything. When the call ended, I sat in silence for nearly an hour. Then I did something I hadn't done since the breakup. I opened the old wedding folder again. Inside were seating charts, floral estimates, venue invoices. But this time I noticed something strange. Several handwritten notes from Mom were tucked between pages. Suggestions, corrections, guest additions, and suddenly I remembered something that felt insignificant at the time. 3 weeks before Daniel ended things, Mom insisted on taking over portions of the wedding planning because I was too overwhelmed. At first it seemed generous. Now I realized it gave her access. More conversations, more influence, more opportunities to isolate him emotionally. I found one sticky note attached to a catering estimate in her handwriting. "Make sure Daniel gets a say too." The smiley face nearly made me throw up. Around this same time, work became overwhelming. Our Boston infrastructure contract entered a critical review phase, which meant 16-hour days and constant site visits. One afternoon in late March, I was standing beneath an agging steel overpass while reviewing corrosion reports when my project manager, Greg, asked if I was okay. "You've triple-checked the same numbers 4 times. I blinked at him. "Sorry." He studied me carefully. Greg was 63 and had spent 4 decades around engineers. He recognized burnout immediately. "You know what structural failures usually come from?" he asked casually. "Accumulated stress." Exactly, not one dramatic event, repeated pressure nobody addresses. I almost laughed at the accidental metaphor. Instead I said quietly, "What if the damage started before the structure was even finished?" Greg looked at me strangely for a second. Then he nodded once. "Then you stop blaming the structure." I actually had to turn away because my eyes burned suddenly. That became the strange thing about this period of my life. Tiny conversations kept cracking me open unexpectedly. A coworker saying you don't have to earn rest. A cashier telling me take your time. My therapist saying your mother trained you to view love as conditional. Every sentence felt like discovering hidden blueprints, explaining the shape of my entire emotional life. In April, Daniel called unexpectedly. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "I found something," he said immediately. My chest tightened. "What?" "A letter." Apparently during a move, he discovered an envelope tucked inside an old legal folder from 2020. My mother's handwriting was on the front. He brought it to me the next day. I remember every detail of that moment. Rainy Tuesday afternoon. 4:18 p.m. He stood awkwardly outside my condo, wearing a navy coat I used to love. And in his hand was the thing that finally erased every remaining doubt I had. The letter was dated March 2nd, 2020. 2 months before our breakup. I recognized Mom's stationery instantly. Cream-colored paper with her initials embossed at the top. Daniel watched silently while I read. "Daniel," it began, "I know this situation is painful, but sometimes love requires difficult choices. Caroline has many strengths, but emotional warmth has never been one of them." My vision blurred immediately. The letter continued for 3 full pages. She described me like a defective machine. Too rigid, too analytical, too emotionally detached. She warned him marriage to me would become a lifetime of loneliness disguised as stability. Then came the line that shattered me completely. You deserve someone who feels like home, not someone who feels like a performance review. I stopped reading, because suddenly every insecurity I ever had made sense. My mother had spent my entire life defining me as fundamentally unlovable in feminine ways. Not soft enough, not warm enough, not easy enough. And eventually she found someone vulnerable enough to believe her. I should have burned it, Daniel whispered. No, I said hoarsely, I needed to see it. He looked wrecked standing there. And honestly, for the first time since all this started, I truly saw his weakness clearly. Not evil. Weakness. My mother didn't force him to leave me. She simply located the fracture line already inside him and applied pressure. That's what manipulators do. They rarely invent insecurities. They weaponize existing ones. Did you ever defend me? I asked quietly. Daniel looked ashamed. Not enough. At least he was honest. Before leaving, he said something that stayed with me long afterward. She talked about you like she was competing with you. That sentence explained more than therapy had so far. Because suddenly memories rearranged themselves differently. Mom criticizing my clothes before dates. Mom interrupting me constantly when male relatives praised my work. Mom calling me intimidating whenever I sounded confident. Mom treating Daniel like the son she wished she had instead of the man I loved. Competition. Not parenting. I barely slept that night. Around 2:00 a.m., I walked into my office and opened an old family photo album. There was one picture from Christmas 1998 that stopped me cold. I was 17. Dad stood beside me proudly, while I showed relatives my acceptance letter to Cornell's engineering program. Mom was smiling in the photo. But now, years later, I noticed something I missed before. Her smile never reached her eyes. I suddenly remembered what she whispered later that night while helping clean dishes. Don't become one of those women nobody wants to marry. 17 years old. That's how early she started preparing me for rejection. I sat there holding that photo until sunrise. By May 2024, the emotional exhaustion finally hit my body physically. I started having migraines again. Chest tightness. Insomnia. One morning I nearly fainted during a site inspection because I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. Dr. Levin finally said something I needed to hear. You are grieving a living person. That changed everything. Because I kept treating the situation like conflict instead of loss. But in reality, the mother I wanted never truly existed. I was mourning possibility. Potential. The fantasy that someday she would suddenly love me safely. And grieving unrealized love is uniquely painful because there's no clean ending. No funeral. No closure. Just repeated disappointment until acceptance slowly replaces hope. One Saturday afternoon in June, I drove past the old neighborhood where I grew up. I hadn't planned to. I just ended up there after missing a highway exit. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Blue shutters, a stone walkway. Dad installed himself in 1994. I sat parked across the street remembering tiny things. Dad teaching me how to use a power drill. Adam crashing his bike into the mailbox. Mom yelling because I got motor oil on my school jeans, helping Dad fix the lawnmower. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 11. Mom had taken Adam shopping for new soccer cleats, but told me to stay home because I was too difficult to shop for. Dad found me building a miniature suspension bridge from string and cardboard in the garage. Instead of leaving me alone, he sat beside me for almost 3 hours helping design support towers. You think differently than other kids, he told me quietly. I remember asking, is that bad? And he answered immediately. No, it just means people won't always understand you. Sitting in my car 28 years later, I finally cried for that little girl properly. Not because she was strange, not because she was difficult, but because she spent so many years believing love had to be earned through usefulness instead of simply received. I drove away before anyone saw me. That night, for the first time in my adult life, I blocked my mother's number completely. Not out of anger, out of exhaustion. There's a point where healing requires silence more than explanation. And honestly, the silence felt peaceful, terrifying at first, then peaceful, like finally stepping out of a building that's been shaking for years and realizing the ground itself is actually stable. By July 2024, I had become someone I barely recognized. Not in dramatic ways. I still woke up at 5:45 every morning, still drank coffee too strong for most people, still color-coded engineering reports because chaos made my skin itch. But emotionally, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I stopped automatically defending my mother in my own head. That sounds small until you realize how children of manipulative parents survive. You become two people at once, one who experiences the hurt and another who immediately explains it away. She didn't mean it like that. She's stressed. She loves you in her own way. She had a hard childhood. You spend decades translating cruelty into something survivable. And once you stop translating, the truth becomes deafening. That summer was brutally hot in Boston, the kind of heat that rose in waves off concrete bridges and turned steel railings too hot to touch by noon. Most of my days were spent overseeing inspections for a rehabilitation project along the Mystic River. We were reinforcing agging support systems before corrosion spread further into the foundation joints. I remember standing beneath one overpass in late July, sweat soaking through my shirt while workers drilled into compromised steel, when one of the younger engineers asked me something unexpected. How do you know when damage is beyond repair? I looked up automatically toward the support beams. Infrastructure. Yes, I answered without thinking. When reinforcement costs more than replacement. The words hit me halfway through saying them, because suddenly I realized that's exactly what I'd been wrestling with emotionally for months. How much of myself was I willing to sacrifice trying to maintain a relationship that kept injuring me? That night I wrote the sentence down in my therapy journal. When reinforcement costs more than replacement. Dr. Levin circled it during our next session. That's grief talking, she said gently. No, I replied quietly, that's clarity. Around the same time, the rest of my family began splitting into camps. Some relatives quietly supported me. Others thought I was overreacting. Because people love family loyalty until loyalty requires accountability. My Aunt Rebecca called me one Sunday afternoon. Your mother is devastated. I stared at my ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. Was she devastated when she paid my fiancé to leave me? That's not fair. I actually laughed. Interesting choice of words. Rebecca sighed heavily. She made a mistake. No, she made a decision. There's a difference. Mistakes are accidental. What my mother did involved planning, secrecy, and sustained manipulation over months. That's architecture, not impulse. She's still your mother, Rebecca said finally. That sentence used to destroy me. Now it just made me tired. Yes, I said quietly, and I'm still her daughter, that didn't stop her. Silence. Then the conversation ended awkwardly, like most family conversations did now. I started noticing something strange after the truth came out. People were deeply uncomfortable with my calmness. If I had screamed more, maybe they would have understood easier. But betrayal exhausted me more than it enraged me. I wasn't interested in revenge fantasies. I just couldn't unknow what I knew. In August, Adam invited me to his house for dinner, while Nicole took the twins to a birthday party. About halfway through eating takeout tacos, he admitted something that made my stomach turn. Mom had tried to contact Daniel again earlier that summer. What for? Adam rubbed his jaw uncomfortably. She wanted him to stop talking to you. I stared at him. She said you were emotionally unstable and revisiting the past too much. The absolute arrogance of that nearly impressed me. She detonates my life and I'm revisiting the past too much. I know. No, seriously, I said, setting down my fork. The level of narcissism required for that sentence should honestly qualify as athletic. Adam laughed despite himself. Then his face became serious again. She blames you completely now. Of course she does. She said you're trying to destroy the family. That one hurt more than I expected. Because deep down, children always carry a primitive fear of exile from their family unit, even grown children. Especially daughters. I leaned back slowly. You know what's insane? What? If she had just apologized sincerely at the beginning, I probably would have forgiven her. Adam looked sad immediately because we both knew it was true. Not instantly. Not easily. But eventually. Instead, she doubled down. Lied. Manipulated. Rewrote reality. And every new lie became another cracked support beam. At one point during dinner, Adam asked quietly, "Do you think Mom ever loved you?" The question sat between us heavily. I thought about it honestly. Yes, I finally said, but not in a healthy way. Because that was the complicated truth. I don't think my mother hated me. I think she needed me emotionally incomplete. There's a difference. Some parents feel threatened when their children become fully independent people, especially daughters who stop seeking permission. And my success created a problem she couldn't control. I made more money than she expected. Built a career she didn't understand. Delayed marriage longer than she approved of. Didn't center my life around being chosen romantically. To her generation, that looked unnatural. Threatening even. And when Daniel loved me anyway, I think part of her resented it. Until she found a way to reclaim control. By September, my insomnia returned badly. Some nights I'd lie awake, replaying old conversations for hours. One memory surfaced repeatedly. December 2019. 5 months before Daniel left. We were at my parents' house decorating Christmas cookies. Mom kept making comments about how exhausted Daniel looked lately. "You poor thing," she told him once while handing him wine. "Caroline probably schedules your relaxation time too." Everyone laughed lightly. Even me. But Daniel looked uncomfortable. Now I realized those comments weren't random. They were groundwork. Tiny seeds planted slowly over time. That's what emotionally manipulative people do best. They create narratives gradually enough that nobody notices the construction happening. A week later, I had an experience that changed something important inside me. I was reviewing blueprints alone at work around 8:30 p.m. when one of our administrative assistants, Maria, stopped by my office. Maria was 58, Dominican, terrifyingly observant, and somehow emotionally wiser than most therapists. She leaned against my doorway, holding a purse over one shoulder. "You're doing it again." I looked up. "Doing what?" "Thinking yourself into pain." I blinked. "What?" She pointed at the blueprint in front of me. "You've been staring at the same page for 20 minutes. I laughed weakly. "Occupational hazard." "No," she said gently, "trauma." The word startled me. I'd avoided using it. Trauma felt too dramatic somehow. Like I hadn't earned it because nobody hit me. Maria walked into my office quietly. "My mother was like yours." That got my attention immediately. "She loved me conditionally," Maria continued, "only when I reflected well on her." I stared at her. "How did you survive that?" She smiled sadly. "I stopped trying to convince someone to love me correctly who benefited from loving me incorrectly." That sentence landed so deeply inside me I physically felt it. Because that was exactly it. My mother gained emotional power from my insecurity. If I always felt slightly inadequate, I stayed reachable, controllable, available for correction. Maria squeezed my shoulder gently before leaving. You're not hard to love, Mija. You were just raised by someone who made affection feel transactional. After she left, I sat alone in my office crying quietly under fluorescent lights, while traffic hummed outside 8 floors below. Not dramatic sobbing. Just grief finally finding language. In October, almost exactly 1 year after the breakfast, something happened I never expected. Mom showed up at my office. Security called upstairs first asking if I wanted to allow her in. I should have said no. Instead, I hesitated long enough for her to appear anyway. She stood in the lobby looking elegant and furious in a grey wool coat. Several co-workers immediately pretended not to watch. Can we talk? She asked tightly. I crossed my arms. You came to my workplace. You blocked my number. Yes. Her jaw tightened. This has gone on long enough. There it was again. As though my pain had become inconvenient for her schedule. We ended up sitting in an empty conference room overlooking the Charles River. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said something that genuinely stunned me. I didn't think it would ruin your life. I stared at her. My life wasn't ruined. You know what I meant. No, I said quietly. Actually, I don't. She exhaled sharply. I thought you move on faster. That sentence explained everything. My mother viewed emotions like temporary obstacles. Annoying but manageable. She genuinely couldn't comprehend why betrayal might permanently alter a relationship. Do you even understand what you did? I asked. I protected you from a bad marriage. You manipulated my fiancé. He was already unhappy. I felt exhaustion wash over me immediately. There it was. Still, no accountability. Only justification. You know what hurts most, I said softly. What? That somewhere inside you, you truly believe this was love. For the first time, her face cracked slightly. Just slightly. Then she said the cruelest thing yet. You would have ended up alone eventually anyway. I went completely still. Not because it hurt. Because suddenly I understood something irreversible. My mother needed that to be true. Needed me fundamentally unchosen. Because if someone loved me deeply despite everything she taught me about myself, then her entire narrative collapsed. And narcissistic people protect their narratives like oxygen. I stood slowly. You should leave. Caroline, you don't get access to me anymore. Her eyes flashed immediately. I'm your mother. And I was your daughter, you still did this. For a second, real emotion crossed her face. Not remorse. Fear. Because she realized I meant it. The connection was actually ending. You'll regret cutting me off when I'm gone someday, she whispered. I looked at her calmly. No, I'll regret spending so many years begging for love that should have been given freely. She left without another word. Afterward, I sat alone in the conference room, shaking harder than I expected. Not from guilt. From adrenaline. Boundaries feel physically terrifying when you weren't raised to have them. That night, I walked nearly 4 miles through Boston alone before going home. Cold air helped. So did movement. Engineers understand force distribution instinctively. Pressure needs somewhere to go or structures fail internally. I think emotions work similarly. By November, something surprising started happening. I began feeling lighter. Not happy exactly, but less consumed. The constant need to analyze every childhood memory started fading. For the first time in years, my nervous system wasn't bracing for emotional impact every day. I started cooking again. reading novels, sleeping through the night occasionally. Tiny things most people take for granted. One Saturday morning, I found myself laughing genuinely at a podcast while grocery shopping and suddenly realized I hadn't thought about my mother once in almost 6 hours. That felt enormous. Healing is weird like that. Not dramatic transformation, just longer spaces between pain. Around Thanksgiving, Daniel emailed again. This time the subject line read simply, "I owe you the truth." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The email was long, painfully honest. He admitted Mom's money mattered less than her approval. That sentence hit me unexpectedly hard, because suddenly I saw the dynamic clearly. Daniel didn't just leave me because of doubt. He got emotionally seduced by my mother's validation. She praised him constantly, made him feel understood, centered. Meanwhile, I was exhausted from work during one of the most demanding years of my career. He chose emotional comfort over loyalty. The money just made the choice easier. At the bottom of the email he wrote, "She made me feel like a hero for leaving you instead of a coward." I closed my laptop slowly. That line haunted me for days because it perfectly described how manipulative people operate. They reframe betrayal as virtue, selfishness as courage, control as love, and weak people accept the version that protects their ego. In December 2024, I spent Christmas alone intentionally for the first time in my life. Adam invited me over repeatedly, but I needed quiet more than company. I ordered Thai food, watched terrible disaster movies, built a tiny Lego architecture set while snow fell outside my townhouse windows. Around midnight, I found myself thinking about Dad again, specifically one memory from when I was 13. We were building shelves in the garage together, and I got frustrated after measuring incorrectly twice. "I keep screwing up," I snapped. Dad looked at me calmly and said, "Structural integrity matters more than perfection." At the time, he meant the shelves. Now I realize he meant life too. That became my focus moving forward. Not becoming emotionally perfect, just structurally honest. No more shrinking myself into someone easier to digest. No more over-explaining my ambition. No more apologizing for taking up intellectual or emotional space. And definitely no more chasing people who benefited from my insecurity. Near the end of January 2025, I received one final message from my mother. Not an apology. Of course not. Just a birthday card. Inside she wrote, "I hope someday you remember I always wanted what was best for you." I stared at that sentence for a long time, then finally understood something freeing. Intentions don't erase damage. Someone can believe they love you while still destroying parts of you. And adulthood is learning that love alone is not enough reason to keep someone close. I threw the card away. Not angrily. Quietly. Like discarding blueprints for a building that was never structurally safe to begin with. By February 2025, people around me started using words like strong and resilient again. I hated those words. Not because they were wrong exactly, but because nobody understands how exhausting resilience becomes when you never ask to need it. At work, I was thriving. That was the strange contradiction of my life then. Emotionally, I was still rebuilding from the inside out, but professionally I had never been more respected. Our Boston Coastal Reinforcement Project had expanded into 3 additional states after winter storm damage exposed severe infrastructure weaknesses across several older bridge systems. Every day I spent hours analyzing structures weakened by years of hidden corrosion. Metal fatigue, water intrusion, stress accumulation, damage nobody noticed until failure became visible. Sometimes it felt like the universe was mocking me with metaphors. One morning in early March, I stood beneath a bridge in Portsmouth reviewing inspection data while freezing Atlantic wind cut through my coat. A younger engineer named Trevor asked why certain sections required total replacement instead of reinforcement. I pointed toward one of the compromised load-bearing joints. Because once deterioration spreads into the core support system, patchwork stops being safe. He nodded thoughtfully. Then I realized I was talking about myself again. That happened constantly now. Everything connected back to family somehow. I think betrayal rewires your perception permanently. You start seeing emotional architecture everywhere. Around this same time, Adam and Nicole began having serious marital problems. At first, I didn't understand why. Then one night Adam called me drunk for the first time in his adult life. "I married Mom," he said immediately after I answered. I sat upright in bed. "What?" Nicole says I shut down emotionally anytime conflict happens. He laughed bitterly. Apparently I learned that from somewhere. The sadness in his voice crushed me. Because my brother wasn't cruel either. He was emotionally underdeveloped in ways nobody noticed because Mom loved him openly. But conditional love damages favored children too, just differently. "What happened?" I asked softly. Adam sighed heavily. Nicole asked why I never defend her around Mom. I already knew the answer. Because survival in our house meant appeasement. Don't challenge Diane. Don't upset Diane. Don't confront Diane. Dad spent decades doing it too. She criticized Nicole's parenting again, Adam continued quietly, and I just sat there. I rubbed my forehead. That's how it starts. What? Realizing silence becomes participation eventually. The line went quiet. Then Adam whispered something that broke my heart. "I think Dad was lonely for a long time." I closed my eyes immediately. Because I'd been realizing the same thing slowly. My father loved quietly, deeply, patiently. But Mom consumed emotional oxygen in every room she entered. Over time, everyone else learned to minimize themselves around her moods. Including him. Especially him. That realization haunted me afterward. Because suddenly my childhood looked different. Dad staying late in the garage wasn't just a hobby. Sometimes it was escape. His long solo fishing trips. His quietness during dinners. The way he always waited for Mom to leave the room before praising me openly. I think he spent years trying to love us both while slowly disappearing himself. And maybe that's why he understood me so well. We were both trying to survive the same emotional climate. In April, something happened that shifted the entire story again. I got a call from a woman named Patricia Holloway. At first the name meant nothing to me. Then she said, "I was friends with your father." And my entire body went still. Patricia was 71 years old and had worked with Dad during his mechanical engineering years in Hartford during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Apparently they stayed close for decades. "I debated contacting you," she admitted gently, "but after hearing about your mother." My stomach tightened immediately. "What about her?" Patricia hesitated carefully. "Your father worried about you constantly." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. "He did." "Yes." Tears hit instantly because Dad rarely verbalized worry directly. He showed love through practical things, fixing brakes, checking tires, leaving cash inside birthday cards long after I became financially independent. Patricia continued softly. "About 6 months before he died, he told me something I never forgot." I gripped the phone harder. He said, "Caroline spent her whole life apologizing for being exactly who she is." That sentence shattered something open inside me. Because it was true. Every achievement in my life came wrapped in apology. Sorry for working late. Sorry for sounding intimidating. Sorry for being independent. Sorry for not needing enough. Sorry for needing too much. I spent 40 years translating myself into softer language for other people's comfort. Patricia's voice interrupted my thoughts gently. Your father adored you. I started crying immediately. Not polite tears. Real grief. The kind that folds your body inward. He used to bring photos of your projects to work, she said warmly. God, he bragged about you constantly. I laughed through tears because I could suddenly picture it perfectly. Dad carrying folded printouts inside his old leather briefcase. Quietly proud. Never loud about it. Just steady. There's something else, Patricia said after a pause. What? He knew your mother sabotaged your confidence. I froze. What? He didn't know specifics, but he knew. The room felt suddenly airless. She was harder on you than Adam, Patricia continued. Your father felt guilty for not stopping it better. That line hurt almost physically. Because even after deaths, Dad was still apologizing for damage he didn't cause. Patricia eventually mailed me copies of several old letters Dad sent her over the years. Most discussed work, agging health. But scattered throughout were references to me. Caroline got promoted again. Caroline designed the load calculations for a major transit project. Caroline works too hard but pretends she doesn't. And one line from 2017 that completely destroyed me. I hope someday she sees herself the way I do instead of the way Diane does. I must have read that sentence 50 times. Because suddenly I understood something devastating. Dad spent years quietly trying to counterbalance the emotional damage Mom caused. Not successfully, but intentionally. And honestly, that mattered more than I can explain. Around the same time, Daniel reappeared again unexpectedly. Not romantically, just present. He emailed occasionally checking on me, sent articles related to engineering projects he thought I'd find interesting. At first I ignored most of them. Then eventually I replied once or twice. People probably expect hatred here. But emotions are rarely that clean after loving someone for years. I didn't want him back. But I also couldn't erase the version of him who once brought me soup during migraines and kissed my forehead while I worked late nights. Humans are messy that way. One evening in May, we met accidentally outside a bookstore in Cambridge. For a second both of us froze awkwardly. Then he smiled sadly. You look healthier. I am healthier. And I realized I meant it. We ended up walking together for nearly an hour. Not as lovers. Not even as friends exactly. Just two people standing inside the ruins of something that once mattered enormously. At one point he stopped walking and asked quietly, "Do you think you'll ever trust anyone again?" The question lingered between us. Yes, I answered finally, but differently. How? I looked toward the river. I won't confuse being chosen with being valued anymore. His face tightened slightly because he understood exactly what I meant. My entire relationship with Daniel revolved around earning love through usefulness. I supported his ambitions emotionally, managed logistics, solved problems, stabilized stress. And somewhere along the way, I believed being indispensable guaranteed safety. But love built on usefulness becomes fragile fast. The second someone finds emotional comfort elsewhere, the structure collapses. I was weak, Daniel admitted quietly. Yes. No hesitation. No cushioning. Just truth. He nodded painfully. I think your mother saw that before I did. She sees weakness in everyone. And you. I thought about it honestly. She couldn't find enough weakness in me anymore. That's why she tried to create it. He stared at me for a long second, then said softly, "You know what scared her most about you?" What? That you eventually stopped needing permission. I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward, because maybe that really was the core issue all along. My mother understood dependence. She understood insecurity. She understood emotional hunger. But self-defined women confused her, threatened her, especially daughters. By June 2025, I finally started dating again. Very casually. A man named Ethan who taught architecture history at MIT. 50 years old, divorced, quiet in a way that felt peaceful instead of withdrawn. Our first date lasted 4 hours because we accidentally started debating whether cities reveal the psychological values of the people who design them. At one point he laughed and said, "You analyze emotions like structural diagrams." I nearly choked on my wine. Apparently everyone noticed except me. Dating terrified me at first. Not because of rejection. Because of trust. Every compliment felt suspicious. Every kindness felt temporary. Trauma trains your nervous system to anticipate collapse. Especially betrayal trauma. One night after dinner, Ethan asked about my family. I hesitated too long. "You don't have to answer," he said gently. But I surprised myself by telling him anyway. Not every detail. Just enough. When I finished, he stayed quiet for a moment before asking softly, "Did anyone in your family ever make you feel emotionally safe?" The answer came immediately. My dad. No hesitation. No confusion. Just certainty. And suddenly I realized something important. I had spent so much time mourning the love my mother failed to give me that I overlooked the love my father actually did. Quietly. Consistently. Imperfectly maybe. But real. That realization changed something fundamental in my grief. Because healing stopped being entirely about loss. It also became about recognition. Seeing the love that existed instead of only the love that didn't. Around this same period, Mom's social world began deteriorating publicly. Word about the situation spread wider through extended family and old family friends. Apparently, several people confronted her privately after learning details. She responded exactly how predictable people like her always do. Victimhood. According to Adam, she cried constantly about being abandoned and misunderstood. But what struck me most was this. She never once apologized sincerely. Not once. Even after losing relationships. Even after exposure. Even after isolation. Because genuine accountability would require dismantling the story she built about herself. And narcissistic people will sacrifice almost anything before sacrificing self-image. Including their own children. In August, I received another package from Dad's estate attorney. Inside were old journals Dad kept during cancer treatment. I read them slowly over several weeks because too much at once hurt. Most entries discussed medical updates, pain levels, fears about dying. But scattered throughout were observations about family. One entry dated November 12, 2017 stopped me cold. Diane criticizes Caroline most when Caroline succeeds publicly. I don't think she realizes she's doing it. Another from February 2018. I worry Caroline mistakes emotional endurance for love. I had to put the journal down after that. Because he saw me. Completely. Not as difficult. Not as intimidating. Not as excessive. Just as seen. And honestly, that validation healed parts of me revenge never could. That's the strange truth nobody tells you. Exposing the people who hurt you feels satisfying briefly. But what actually heals you is finally receiving accurate love somewhere. Even belatedly. Even imperfectly. In September 2025, nearly 2 years after the breakfast, I visited Dad's grave alone for the first time since the funeral. Cold mornings. Grey sky. Wind moving through cemetery trees softly. I brought coffee because he always drank terrible gas station coffee during early site inspections. I sat there for almost an hour talking quietly like an insane person. About work. About Boston. About Mom. About everything. At one point I laughed softly and said, "You were right about her." Then immediately started crying because I suddenly remembered something from childhood. I was maybe 8 years old helping Dad build a birdhouse in the garage. Mom came outside irritated because sawdust kept blowing toward the driveway. "This whole thing is unnecessary," she complained. Dad waited until she left. Then he leaned toward me and whispered conspiratorially, "Most worthwhile things are." I laughed through tears remembering it. Because maybe surviving emotionally was like engineering too. Not about avoiding damage entirely. About building enough internal support to survive pressure without collapsing permanently. Before leaving the cemetery, I placed my hand against the cold granite marker and said something I wish I'd understood earlier. "You loved me enough." And for the first time in years, I believed it myself. By October 2025, 2 full years had passed since the breakfast that split my life into a before and after. Sometimes I still thought about how ordinary the morning looked from the outside. Blueberry pancakes, coffee steaming from chipped ceramic mugs, my nephews arguing over syrup, the kind of family scene people photograph for holiday cards. And sitting quietly underneath it all, like rust hidden inside steel, was the truth that my mother had spent years trying to dismantle my sense of worth one subtle comment at a time. That's what stayed with me most in the end. Not the money. Not even Daniel. The realization that emotional sabotage rarely arrives dramatically. Most of the time it sounds like concern, advice, worry, protection. "You're intimidating. You work too much. You're hard to love." By the time someone says it enough, you start reinforcing the lie from inside yourself. But by then, something in me had changed permanently. I no longer viewed healing as becoming softer or easier for other people to handle. Healing became learning how to stop apologizing for existing at full size. That fall, work took me constantly between Boston, Portland, and Providence, overseeing reinforcement phases for several agging bridge systems before winter weather hit. I loved the rhythm of it. Early train rides, blueprints spread across conference tables, cold air carrying the smell of salt water and wet concrete near coastal sites. For the first time in years, my life felt grounded in reality instead of emotional survival. Not perfect, just honest. Ethan became part of that honesty slowly. No dramatic romance montage. No sweeping declarations. Just consistency. He remembered details. Showed up when he said he would. Listened without trying to fix me. One night in November, we sat on my townhouse floor eating takeout because my dining chairs still hadn't arrived after 3 months. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while jazz played quietly from my kitchen speaker. At one point, he looked around at the half-unpacked books stacked against the walls and smiled. "You know what I like about this place?" "What?" "It feels lived in, not curated." That sentence hit me unexpectedly hard. Because my mother curated everything. Her house, her image, her stories, even people. Especially people. But this little townhouse with mismatched furniture and engineering manuals, piled beside cookbooks, felt like the first place in my life where I existed without performance. Later that night, Ethan asked something quietly while helping me assemble a bookshelf. "Do you ever miss her?" I tightened a screw carefully before answering. "Yes." Not because she deserved missing. Because grief doesn't disappear simply because someone harmed you. I missed the possibility of her. The version of motherhood I kept hoping existed underneath everything else. "You know what's strange?" I admitted. "What?" "I spent years thinking if I achieved enough, she'd finally approve of me." Ethan looked at me gently. "And now?" I thought about it honestly. Now I think some people only feel stable when someone else feels inadequate. He didn't argue. Didn't minimize it. Just nodded quietly like he understood. That alone felt healing. In December, Adam called with news I somehow knew was coming. Mom had fallen in her kitchen and fractured her wrist. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to require help for several weeks. I think you should visit her, he said carefully. I stared out my office window at snow beginning to fall across Boston. The old version of me would have gone immediately. Out of guilt, out of obligation, out of fear of seeming cruel. But healing changes your instincts slowly. I'll think about it, I said honestly. For 3 days I wrestled with the decision. Not because I wanted reconciliation, because part of me still carried responsibility for her emotions automatically. That conditioning runs deep. Eventually, on December 14th, 2025, I drove to Connecticut. The house looked exactly the same. Same wreath on the front door. Same expensive porch furniture nobody used. But stepping inside felt different now. Smaller somehow. Less powerful. Mom sat in the living room wearing a wrist brace and looking irritated more than injured. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "You look older." I almost laughed. "So do you." That earned the faintest smile from her. It was probably the most honest interaction we'd had in years. I made tea because silence felt unbearable otherwise. The kitchen still smelled faintly like vanilla candles and lemon cleaner, exactly the way it always had growing up. Memory is cruel that way. Even painful places contain comfort sometimes. When I returned to the living room, Mom surprised me by speaking first. "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't." She nodded slightly like she respected the honesty. For nearly 20 minutes we talked about safe topics. Weather, Adam's kids, my work, nothing real. Then finally she asked the question sitting between us both. "Do you hate me?" I looked at her carefully. For the first time in my life she looked old. Not elegant old. Just tired. Human. And suddenly I understood something that changed the entire shape of my anger. My mother had spent her entire life terrified of irrelevance. Terrified of agging. Terrified of losing emotional control over the people around her. Everything she did came from that fear eventually. The manipulation. The criticism. The sabotage. None of it excused what she did. But understanding is different from excusing. "No," I said finally, "I don't hate you." She looked relieved immediately. "But I don't trust you either." The relief disappeared. And there it was. The real consequence. Not punishment. Reality. You can love someone and still recognize they are unsafe for you emotionally. "I was trying to protect you," she whispered. I shook my head slowly. "No, you were trying to control the outcome." Her eyes filled with tears instantly. And for the first time in my entire life, I didn't rush to comfort her. I just let the emotion exist without making myself responsible for it. "You know what hurts most?" I asked quietly. "What?" "That you genuinely believed there was something wrong with me for being ambitious." She looked down at her brace. "You were so much like your father." There it was again. Always Dad. Always the comparison. But this time, instead of pain, I felt pride. "Good," I said softly. That startled her. I continued before fear could stop me. "He loved me without making me earn it." The room went completely silent. Mom stared at me for several seconds, then looked away first. And somehow that tiny moment felt larger than every argument before it. Because for once I wasn't defending myself. I was simply telling the truth. Before leaving, I helped carry groceries into her kitchen. As I turned to go, she asked quietly, "Will you come back?" I thought carefully before answering. "Maybe, but things won't ever be what they were." She nodded once. I think part of her finally understood that. Not emotionally, maybe, but factually. Some damage changes structures permanently, and pretending otherwise only risks further collapse. When I got home that night, Ethan was asleep on my couch waiting for me because he knew the visit would be difficult. Blanket half falling onto the floor, book open against his chest, lamp still on. The sight hit me so hard emotionally, I had to stand there for a second. Because this was what safe love looked like. Not intensity, not control. Presence. Quiet, reliable presence. I covered him with the blanket properly, and he woke slightly. "How'd it go?" he murmured sleepily. I sat beside him. She finally looked human to me. And I stared at the soft yellow light filling the room. And I finally stopped feeling like a child around her. That was the real ending of the story. Not exposing her. Not the inheritance. Not even losing Daniel. The real ending happened the moment I stopped measuring my worth against my mother's ability to recognize it. A few months later, in March 2026, I got promoted to Regional Structural Director for our entire Northeast Coastal Division. The promotion came with more money, more responsibility, and an office overlooking Boston Harbor. On my first morning there, I stood by the giant windows watching sunlight hit the water while construction cranes moved slowly in the distance. 2 years earlier, I would have called Mom immediately, hoping she'd sound proud. This time I called Adam. Then Ethan. That was it. And honestly, the peace inside that choice felt enormous. A week after the promotion, I found one final letter from Dad tucked inside an old engineering textbook while unpacking storage boxes. I must have missed it before. The paper was folded carefully, dated only 6 months before he died. His handwriting shook more than usual because of the cancer treatments. "Caroline," it began, "if you spend your life trying to become acceptable to people committed to misunderstanding you, you will exhaust yourself completely." I had to sit down before continuing. There is nothing wrong with your mind, your ambition, your seriousness, or your heart. Some people confuse quiet love with absence because they only recognize loud emotion. Don't let that confusion become your identity. By then I was crying too hard to see properly. But the last lines healed something inside me forever. You do not need to become smaller to deserve connection. The right people will not ask you to apologize for your strength. I pressed the letter against my chest and cried for almost an hour. Not because I was broken anymore. Because after 42 years, I finally believed him. That spring, Ethan and I took a weekend trip to Maine. Nothing extravagant. Tiny coastal town. Cold ocean air. Lobster rolls from a roadside shack with peeling paint. One morning, we walked along the rocky shoreline before sunrise, while waves crashed hard against dark stone. At one point, Ethan reached for my hand naturally, casually, like it was the easiest thing in the world. And suddenly, I realized something quietly beautiful. My body no longer expected abandonment every time someone loved me gently. That fear had started loosening its grip. Not completely. Maybe not ever completely. But enough. Enough to breathe differently. Enough to rest. Enough to imagine a future without constantly bracing for emotional collapse. We sat together on a cold wooden bench, overlooking the water while gulls circled overhead. The sky slowly turned pale blue. And for the first time in years, silence felt safe instead of threatening. That's the thing I wish more people understood about healing from family betrayal. It's rarely dramatic. No perfect revenge speech. No magical closure. Just small moments where your nervous system realizes the danger has passed. Mom still sends birthday cards sometimes. Short messages. Careful language. We speak occasionally now, but with distance. Boundaries. Reality. And honestly, that's the healthiest our relationship has ever been. Because I stopped sacrificing myself to maintain it. If there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's this. Love cannot exist properly where authenticity is punished. And people who benefit from your self-doubt will always feel threatened when you finally trust yourself. For years, I believed strength meant enduring emotional pain quietly. Now I think real strength is recognizing when endurance becomes self-destruction. A few weeks ago, one of my newer engineers made a mistake during a load distribution presentation and immediately started apologizing excessively. Her hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I know I'm being difficult." That word hit me instantly. Difficult. I looked at this brilliant young woman, standing there terrified of taking up space, and suddenly saw myself at 25. At 15. At 9. And before I even thought about it, I told her the thing I wish someone had told me decades earlier. You are not difficult for needing patience while you learn. She looked stunned, then relieved. Such a small moment. But maybe that's how healing continues. Not through revenge. Through refusing to pass the damage forward. I still think about that breakfast sometimes. The pancakes, the syrup. My mother smiling while casually destroying the last illusion I had about our family. And weirdly, I'm grateful now that the truth surfaced when it did. Because hidden structural damage doesn't disappear just because nobody acknowledges it. Eventually, everything built on top of it becomes unstable too. My life didn't collapse that morning. It revealed itself. And once I finally stopped trying to repair relationships that depended on my silence, I discovered something unexpected waiting underneath all the grief. Peace. Quiet, ordinary, hardened peace. The kind that doesn't need permission from anyone else to exist.